Hi everyone, my name is Kristi Arzola and I've been painting with watercolors for over 20 years and I wanted to share my knowledge today. This is going to be a real-time video, not sped up. I'm not going to have any background music, so you can set up your own music and just relax and paint along with me. Let's get started. These are the materials I'll be using today. It's pretty standard for my materials, so once you get used to my tutorials, they will come as no surprise. However, you're welcome to pause the video and take a look in the video description for a list of these materials. Otherwise, let's get to painting. You do not by any means need to use so many colors for this painting, but I went all out. So lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, sap green, cerulean blue, ultramarine, dioxazine purple, purple lake, and Payne's gray. You could definitely do less than this, but pause the video because I did list these specific colors in the video description. However, feel free to just use what you have. You don't have to use the exact same colors. In my video tutorials, I like to provide both a reference photo as well as a line drawing. And you can go to the video description to download either of these to use at home. The line drawing is optional for those of you that don't feel comfortable drawing the subject. I want you to simply print the line drawing at the scale you plan on painting it. Once you've printed it, on the back of the line drawing, you're just going to take pencil and apply graphite behind the image, and then you're going to tape it in position on your watercolor paper so the graphite's touching. Once you've done that, just take a ballpoint pen, trace the image. Sometimes less lines are better. And once you've done that, because of the pressure of your pen, it's going to push that graphite onto your watercolor paper. And that's going to set you up so you're ready to paint for today. Now I have gone ahead and darkened some of my lines just for the sake of the tutorial today. That way you can all clearly see what it is I'm doing. Now I would like to create a blurred background behind today's subject, and that would be rather difficult to do if I don't protect my flower using masking fluid, or otherwise known as drawing gum. This is the brand I'm currently using, but there's many brands out there. What I like to do when I'm applying masking fluid is I put a little bit of Dawn dish soap inside a small cup. And by coating my brush in that Dawn dish soap, it's just going to protect my tools so that when I come in to apply masking fluid to the outside edges of my flower, I have less risk of the masking fluid permanently bonding to my brush and ruining my brush. Now I only go a short distance because masking fluids can still be temperamental. So I re-rinse my brush in the soapy water after I go a short distance, and then I continue to apply the masking fluid. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with masking fluid, it's a liquid that dries pretty quickly, and it's going to have a rubber or plastic type finish, which will resist the paint. So the purpose of this is I'm applying it to the outside edges of my flower. So when I'm painting the background, I don't feel as pressured to be super perfect with my brush control. The masking fluid allows me to kind of get those background colors in more quickly with peace of mind that none of the colors are going to accidentally go on top of my floral. So in my opinion, it just gives me a neater end product. But you could typically do this without masking the flower. You just have to be really careful when you're painting your background and you're up close to the subject. I'm rinsing in that soapy water again to protect my tools. Now, when you're applying masking fluid, you might be tempted just to rush so you can get to the painting faster. However, I do want to caution you with rushing the process because masking fluid and the way you apply it is equally as important as paint. It will determine whether or not you have a neat end product or one that looks a little rushed. So just take your time with it. I'm also going to be applying some masking fluid to the stem of today's floral. And I am going to be filling the stem in. I'm taking my time trying to be consistent with the thickness. Now, if at any point during the masking fluid process I feel like, whoops, I didn't apply it right, I just let it dry, and with firm pressure I can peel it up after it's dried and then reapply again. So you don't have to, proceed forward if you applied your masking fluid in a way that is less than your standards. You can always just peel it up and go again. Now, I am not working on a watercolor block today. This is just a pad of Arches watercolor paper. So under all of the moisture I'll be using today, I do expect some buckling, which will cause me a little bit of frustration. But to be honest, I was running out of the watercolor blocks. So I just have to work with what I had in my studio, and I'm sure you guys all understand and can relate. So I'm just kind of adding some textures to the top here. And I'm now going to let all of this masking fluid dry. It won't take more than maybe 5 minutes. Now that I'm done with the masking fluid, I'm going to make sure to rinse my brush really well in that soapy water. I do not want it ruining my tools. And then after I've rinsed the masking fluid out, I'm going to go a step further and rinse the soapy water out of my brush, because Dawn dish soap in your watercolor paints isn't exactly going to give you the most predictable results. So while that masking fluid is drying, I'm going to use a number 10 round to mix some colors to use in my background. I'm going to allow my brush to hold as much clean water as it is willing to hold, and I'm going to use my brush to transfer clean water over to different areas of my palette. I'm going to be mixing up a few different colors to use in my background, but I want this background to be blurred and to be soft, so my colors are not going to be too dark, and I'm not going to need too many of them. So I have a little puddle of water, maybe the size of a dime, in 4 different areas of my palette, and now I'm going to begin mixing some colors. Now, dioxazine purple is a staining pigment in the Coatman line of paints, so I just want to be aware of that, because wherever it goes down, it is going to want to stay. So I just need to be cautious and mindful if that's the purple I'm using. If you are concerned about using staining pigments, and because they can sometimes be unforgivable, you can actually just mix your own purple using some sort of non-staining red and blue and mix them together. So right now I have a nice purple, but I want to get more of a periwinkle blue-purple color. So I'm going to now add some blue to it. I'm going to use the ultramarine blue. It's kind of a darker navy blue, and it is a granulating color, so it's going to dry with some texture, but I just really like the combination of that blue with the purple. The next color I'm going to mix up is going to be just a lighter version of that same purple. So I just pulled from the same color I just made, pulled it aside and into some excess water so it's more diluted. Now I'm going to mix up a couple different variations of green. So I'm using sap green. And in one well, it's going to be a lighter, more of a lime green. And in the second well, I'm going to actually darken it up by adding some blues. So right now I'm just putting sap green in two different areas of my palette. I used quite a bit of pigment, so it's as dark as this sap green will go. And now, in order to make my lime green, I'm going to add some lemon yellow to one of them. Once I know the paint is dissolved, I drag my brush across the rim of my palette, test out my paint colors, make sure they're the value that I'm looking for. If I want them to go darker, I add more paint. If I want them to be lighter, I add more water. Now I do want a darker, deeper green. So the second green, I'm going to be adding that ultramarine blue to darken it up. Once I feel like that green might be close, I'm going to test it out. I feel like I really want that color to be darker still, so I'm going to continue to add more pigment to this mixture. We want to keep in mind that watercolors dry to be about 20% lighter than the way they appear when they're wet. And when you're working with a wet into wet on a background, that's going to further dilute your colors even more. So just be aware of those techniques. They tend to wash out your colors, so you want to mix them to be just a little darker than you expect. When you feel like your color might be ready, just test it out. And that's the color I want. I want something that's just a little darker, and that'll work nicely. Now that I have my paint colors ready to go, I'm going to rinse my brush and use clean water to apply a thin layer of water across the back. Now I did take some tape and I taped kind of the four corners of my paper just to minimize the buckling so it doesn't get too inconvenient. So you may want to do the same thing. Just pause your video, kind of wrap some tape around the four corners so it at least tries to keep your paper straight as much as possible. Because you never know, sometimes the paper just really bends a lot depending on the day. If you're working on a watercolor block, you won't have to worry about it as much. So because I have that masking fluid down, I can apply my water rather quickly. And if my water hits the masking fluid, I don't even care. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So once I have water coating the entire background, I'm going to use the lights to just kind of double check that I have good coverage everywhere and that there are no puddles. If I do have areas where there's puddling, I dry my brush off and soak up the excess water. because I don't need it to dilute my colors. Plus the puddles make it difficult to control where your paint goes. So I'm going to give this just a moment to kind of absorb into this cotton paper. And I'm using my brush just to continue making sure things are even, but I'm not introducing any additional water. If there's any areas where I see like it's losing its gloss, I just kind of come in and push some moisture into that area without actually re-dipping my brush in clean water. So I'm just letting this kind of soak into the fibers of the paper a little bit more, and that way the color, when I introduce it, it doesn't bleed or travel as far, but it'll still give me those soft edges. All right, so right now everything is glossy, but no puddles, okay? However, my paper is ready to dry. It's not going to wait for me, so I need to kind of boogie when it comes to getting this blurred background in. So I'm going to grab the watered down purple, being mindful that this is a staining pigment, and wherever I put it, it's going to want to stick around. So I just want to kind of give a hint of a flower bed in the background, but the paint isn't going as far because I kind of let the water absorb into the paper a bit more, which is a lovely stage to be in. And I'm establishing my purples first so that I can be mindful of them when I introduce my greens. Otherwise, sometimes I can go a little overboard and I can forget where it is I wanted some purples. So this is just that watered down purple. Now, before things begin to dry, I'm going to grab some of that darker purple, but I'm really wiping away the excess and going an extra step of tapping my sponge. Now, I'm not going to put this darker purple everywhere. Just a little hint here and there to kind of imply different values in these blurred flowers. As long as I'm not going in with an overloaded paintbrush, my paint should stay relatively close to wherever it is I introduce it. Now I'm done with those purples, so I'm rinsing all that purple out of my brush, and I'm going to grab some of those lime greens. Now keeping in mind, this paper wants to dry already, so I need to be aware of that and not lollygag. So I'm getting some areas that are losing their gloss, so I need to stay out of those zones, and I need to get some of these dark greens in before it goes too far. Now with just clean water on my brush, if I want, I can come into some areas while things are still damp and kind of do some blending or narrow some of my paint strokes by using a barely damp brush. So I'm just taking a clean, practically dry brush and dragging it with firm pressure across my damp paper to kind of refine the shapes that I'm creating. I'm just going to introduce a little bit more of that really watered down purple. Just so it looks like that purple is in front of some of those greens. But things are definitely beginning to dry, so I need to kind of stop, accept it for what it is, and let this be. So those of you that know me know I'm not super patient with watching paint dry, so I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so we can jump right into the flower. Now that the paint is completely dry, I can remove my masking fluid and begin working on the floral. To do this, you can just use clean fingers and firm pressure and move across the masking fluid and it will peel right up. However, if you have a rubber cement pickup, they're just kind of a rubber block, you can use that as well, and it just kind of minimizes a little bit more of the mess because that masking fluid tends to adhere to the edges of the little rubber block, so there's not as much of a mess on your work surface. But you can see how well this masking fluid kept the paint out of the area of the flower. The downside is that when you remove it, it will sometimes lift, soften, or erase some of your pencil lines. So we may have to redraw some lines if we need to. All right, so some of my lines have softened. So I'm just going to come in with real gentle pressure using a pencil just to reestablish some of them. Okay, so now in the center of the flower, we have some of the yellow pollen. And in order to paint the petals of my flower freely, I want to make sure I kind of protect those areas of yellow. It's going to be hard to get a vibrant yellow if I am working on top of some blues and purples. So what I'm going to do is I'm not even going to worry about having the center drawn. I'm just going to erase that out of there. And I'm going to return to my masking fluid. And if you recall, we want to protect our tools by coating our paintbrush with that soapy dish soap before we dip in our masking fluid. Now I'm just using a number 6 round. You can switch to a smaller brush for this if you'd like. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to mask where it is I want those little yellow pollen to be. Now some of them are running into each other, so don't be afraid to let some of your masking fluid kind of run into each other. That's okay. I'm going to rinse that masking fluid out of my brush using that dish soap. And then I'm going to make sure to get that dish soap out of my brush, so I'm rinsing in regular water after that. So while the masking fluid is drying, I'm going to mix up a couple additional colors to use in the floral. So right now, all the purples I have on my palette have that added ultramarine blue. I do want to make sure I have one purple that is just a soft, more of a pink purple. So I'm using Purple Lake. I'm going to add the tiniest amount of that dioxazine purple to it, so at least we have some color harmony. And I'm going to water that down a lot. I want a really soft pastel. I feel good about that. The other color I'm going to make up is going to be using that ultramarine blue for more of a blue purple to use in shadows. So I'm still using a little bit of that dioxazine purple, but I'm going to be heavier with my blue. And I might even add a little bit of Payne's Gray to it, so it's a little bit more of a navy blue. Because I love having contrast in my paintings, so that's kind of the color I've got, and I'm happy with that. Okay, so that masking fluid in the center is still drying, which will give me time to work on the stem of my flower. Now, if you have any real dark pencil lines along your stem, they will possibly show through depending on how dark or light your green paint is. So if you're concerned about your pencil lines showing through, just lighten them up using a kneaded eraser and tapping the surface of the line. I'm going to be painting mine wet on dry. So I'm going to dip my brush really well into that lime green to start off with. I'm going to start at the top. And I'm going to do my best to keep this stem even in width, which after drinking 2 cups of coffee isn't always easy to do. And I'm tapping my brush in there to encourage it to stay wet a little longer so I have a chance to kind of introduce shadows where I want them. So I'm deliberately allowing there to be puddling. So I tap my brush along that stem to encourage some puddles. That way it doesn't dry as quickly. And before it dries, I'm going to come in with that darker green I made up and tap that in to a few areas to make a darker shadow. So I'm continuing to tap my brush to make sure to resaturate. I'm not giving it time to dry. All right, so now that I have the whole stem filled in with that lime green, I'm going to rinse and tap my sponge, and I'm going to get some of that dark green and introduce it into areas where I want shadows on my stem. So where the stem curves, I want there to be some darker greens there. So I'm just tapping my darker greens on top of the wet green. And I'm now going to kind of hug the right edge of the stem to get a little bit more of a darker color on the right side. Now, right now it's very textured because of the way I'm applying the color, and I'm okay with that at the moment. But now, before that dries, I'm going to take my brush and kind of trace the back edge of the stem in one stroke, if I can manage it, to try and just clean up that edge and make it more of a solid green. Now my stem kept getting wider as it goes down, and that's okay. I'm just going to let that be, but at least now we have a range of values in that stem. Now that I'm ready for this stem to dry, I can come in with a clean, practically dry brush, and I can soak up any puddling if I want, just to encourage the stem to dry a little faster. Now, while that's drying, I want to be mindful of it so I don't rust my hand in it. And I'm going to proceed with painting the flower. I do have some areas where the masking fluid is still drying, so I'm going to work on these upper petals first. I'm going to start with clean water, and I'm just going to fill this entire upper section with the exception of the fold. And actually, I should soften some of those pencil lines. So I'm going to lift some of that water out because I'm looking at some of those pencil lines and the values that I want, and I'm thinking that might be a bit too dark. So before I wet everything down, I'm just going to soften some of these pencil lines a bit. And it is what it is. Okay. Going in with clean water. I don't want to come in contact with the wet stem, or that's going to encourage greens to bleed into my flower. So I am keeping some space from that wet stem. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once I have that upper section wet with water, but it's nice and even, I'm now going to introduce some of my colors. Now, the colors on the left side of this flower are very much washed out because it's so close to our light source. So I'm being mindful of that, and I'm going to make sure the color I use is almost barely any color. So it is very watered down. I want it to be really, really soft. Be mindful of that wet stem. If it hasn't dried yet, give it some space. Anytime I'm along an outside edge, I try to get a nice clean edge by tracing it with my brush. Now that I have this really nice, soft, muted color in here, I'm going to switch to my number 2 round and start introducing colors that are a little bit more dark. So I'm grabbing that darker purple and blue mixture that we used for the background. And I want to make sure that this central area of the flower is a little darker. Notice how I'm not bringing that dark color all the way down to the bottom. Once your green stem is completely dry, you can bring that darker purple to be more up close. And I feel like my purples just don't have enough blue in them. So I'm going to add some more blue because why not? So I just added some cerulean blue to some of my mixtures and I feel better about this color already. And notice how I'm kind of dragging my brush while following the contour of the petal, and I'm allowing multiple colors to show. I'm not trying to just fill it in with the same solid color. I'm allowing some streaks in there. And then before this dries, I'm going to introduce that really dark navy blue that we had mixed up for some shadows, especially for the back right end. Now, if I press too hard with my brush, the paint won't want to come out of it. So keep a light touch when you're dragging your brush through a wet area. And a lighter touch will allow your brush to release more paint. Anywhere where you pick up your brush, it is going to leave a little blurb. And that's just kind of what watercolors do. Now before this dries, I rinse my small number 2 round and I dry it off. And with a clean, dry brush, I can come through on this wet surface and kind of perfect any blends that I want. But if things are already beginning to dry, I need to get out. So if you have no gloss left to your paper, your working time is over. Resist going back in. You can always do another layer later. So I'm happy with that. My masking fluid is now dry, but I cannot paint that area because it's sharing an edge with the area I just painted. So I need to give these areas some space. So while they're drying, I'm going to paint some texture on the stem. So this is just a little bit of that cerulean blue and purple mixture. And I'm just kind of changing my values as I'm painting this area. All right, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can move on with the flower. Now that it's dry, I'm going to come in with my number 6 round and add some clean water to the lower half of the blossom, and I'm going right over that masking fluid that is now dry. If you have dark pencil lines, I always forget about them. I'm a little off my game today. Lighten up some of those dark pencil lines before you go in. Keep forgetting about this. Okay, these colors are going to be pretty dark though, so taking my time with my water when I'm up against the edge of each of the petals. I'm going to tilt my paper so you can see how much water is there. I don't have any puddles, but I definitely have a shine that is maintaining. I'm now going to use some of that purple lake that I mixed up. And it's kind of more of a pink purple. And I know at this stage, it doesn't quite make sense why I'm introducing this, but I want to have a subtle kind of more of a pink purple to the center of the flower in the area of the pollen. So that's why I'm doing this, because I'm going to be painting this in multiple layers. I'm maintaining a little area of white so it kind of looks like a fold on that petal that's in front. And then as I near that outside edge, I'm going to be switching to more of that watered down blue and purple mixture where I use that cerulean. Anytime I'm going all the way around the edge of the petal, I'm trying to do it in one stroke so I have less texture. You can switch to a small brush if it's going to give you better visibility. However, smaller brushes take longer to fill a large space. So I find that oftentimes if I switch to a smaller brush, I can't make as much progress as quickly as I'd like before the paper begins to dry. So just be mindful of that. Now, while everything is still very damp, I'm going to grab some of that darker purple, and I just want to kind of imply the curves of each petal. Notice how I'm not doing it in a sketching, paint stroke. I'm trying to do it in one stroke Start at the end, follow the contour, and then end the line. This is just layer 1. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer to move on to the next step. Now I want there to be, the narrow line work for in the center of the flower where the pollen is. Rather than feeling the need to paint around them in a tedious way, I'm going to be using masking fluid to protect. So I'm using my number 2 round. I'm coating it in that soapy water before I use the masking fluid. And I want to make sure I don't overload my brush, so I only get a thin amount on my brush. And I go to each little area of pollen and I drag a narrow line to the back of the flower. And I'm going to do that for each of the little pollen dots. And I'm sure my anatomy of the floral is off, but you get what I'm trying to say. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to make sure to rinse all of that masking fluid out of my brush and rinse that soap out of my brush before I put my masking fluid away. Now I'm going to let that masking fluid dry, and in the meantime I can work on some of the details of these upper petals. So I'm using my number 6 round, and I'm going to do some edge softening using that dark navy blue. So I want to come in right to the edge of the petal, create a shadow, and I'm only going to come about partway down. I'm going to soak up any puddling of that paint, and then I'm going to rinse my brush really well, tap my sponge to remove the excess water, and I'm just going to the very end of it to drag and soften. And as I soften it, I'm curving my brush stroke to follow the contour of that petal. Now I'm going to get more of that dark navy blue, and on the far right edge, I'm making sure my brush isn't overloaded with paint and I don't have any water droplets hanging out on the metal ferrule. I'm going to be adding some more darks. These darks, though, are going to end up tapering off into a very narrow point as they follow the petal. Now I'm going to rinse my brush really well, tap away the excess water so it's barely damp, and I'm going to soften this top edge. So now we're at least getting a stronger light source, and that's going to really help give definition to the flower. I'm going to get more of that cerulean blue and purple mixture. This is a lighter color, not as dark. And I'm going to come in right to the front edge to darken it up a bit. But I'm going to rinse my brush, tap my sponge lightly to get rid of the water droplets. So it's just a lightly damp brush, but not wet. And with that clean water, I'm going to soften and blend that color. So now we have more definition between the three petals. Masking fluid is still drying in a couple small areas, so I'm not going to mess with it. I'd rather be safe than sorry. So meanwhile, I'm going to come in and add more definition to this fold on the underside. I'm using that periwinkle blue again. That's got the cerulean in purple. I'm going to follow this curve to the inside. And then as I move my way out, I do a little bit of edge softening, so a barely damp brush, and I just pull that paint to kind of blend it with the rest of that section of the petal. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, using that periwinkle blue, making sure my brush isn't overloaded. So I sometimes tap my sponge or paper towel to remove the excess. Rinsing my brush and doing a little bit of edge softening with a very light touch. I have barely any moisture on my brush. Okay, so now that the masking fluid in the center is completely dry, I can now push the darks in the center of the flower so I can get more depth. Right now, I have very similar values between the back petals as well as these forward petals, and that needs to change. So I'm going to come in with that really dark navy blue. I'm going right on top of the masking fluid, but I'm being aware of where that petal edge is, despite that my masking fluid might go beyond it. And by getting this real nice dark blue in, it's going to really add depth. I'm now going to rinse my brush, tap away the excess water, and I'm just going to soften and blend the edge. I have to occasionally re-rinse and re-dry my brush. And keep in mind, I have been practicing my edge softening techniques for years. I occasionally might make it look relatively easy to do, but in all honesty, it took a while for me to kind of get down the technique. So if you're new to watercolors, be patient with yourself and just practice softening wet paint edges and making the edges kind of disappear and blend with the background. It's all about how much water you have on your brush. Too much and the water will kick back into your paint. Too little and the edge won't soften. If you're too slow, your paint will dry too fast. There's many factors involved, so just be aware of that. I'm going to hit that paint with the blow dryer now so we can move on to the next step. Now that everything is dry, I can use a small brush. This is just my number 2 round. And I can start to add more petal texture and definition between each petal. So if I want, I can come in to the edge of this petal with just water, and I can move my brush back and forth, and the water is going to reactivate some of that paint that is already dried, and it's just going to lift a bit, just enough to indicate where that petal edge is. And I can do the same thing on the opposite side. So I'm just using clean water on this small number 2 round, and I'm going back and forth across the edge where I might want less darks. So it kind of shows the edge of one of the petals. And you can see now the difference between those two areas. I can now also come in with painting wet on dry using that periwinkle blue and just doing some glazing that follows the contour of the folds. So now it's just all about pushing the values. I'm making sure my brush isn't overloaded with paint. Basically just doing gentle glazes of color just to imply some texture. Now right now the flower is looking kind of funky, but I promise when I remove that masking fluid and then do the central details of the flower, you're going to really like the results. But there's always so many different ways you can paint with watercolors, so you just got to stay true to yourself and try different techniques. Find out what works for you. I can keep using this periwinkle blue to add more petal texture. All right, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so we can lift the masking fluid and do some of the finishing touches. Now that everything's completely dry, I can use my fingers or rubber cement pickup to remove the masking fluid. Now I'm going to use my small number 2 brush to add some cadmium yellow. Now this yellow is in shadow, so we should add the smallest amount of purple to it just to get more of a golden color. You could also just use more of a yellow ochre if that's your preference. But I'm going to at least get a lighter yellow on each area first, and then I'm going to come back with the darker golden yellow and add some texture so it actually looks like pollen. Now I can bring that golden yellow into the mix, and I really make sure to wipe off the excess paint so my brush has minimal on it. I'm making sure there's no water droplets hanging out on that metal ferrule. And I'm going to come in and just add little dots to indicate some texture. So I'm not trying to completely cover up the entire area. But I just want to at least have some sort of texture in there. Now, while that yellow is drying, we can introduce more of that purple lake. So anytime you put masking fluid on top of dry paint, when you lift it later, it will be lifting off some of the color. So the value will lighten. So it's kind of a gamble of whether or not you might have to do a second layer. But I just like that it kind of gives me a little bit more of a cleaner result. Now I'm going to let the center of the flower have a moment to kind of dry a bit before messing with it further. I'm going to lift the left edge of the stem to make it a little brighter. So I'm using a square stiff brush that I've gotten wet. I've used my fingers to remove water droplets, and I have a clean paper towel handy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in, I'm staying inside the stem, but just that left edge of the stem, I want to brighten for better contrast and to make it look like the sun is shining off of it. So I'm just moving my damp brush back and forth just on the inside of the stem to brighten it up a bit. I'm going to re-rinse my brush, remove the water droplets again. And I'm barely applying any pressure. The movement of my brush and how far I'm moving it is very minimal. It doesn't take much. I can tap my paper towel to kind of lift up some of the color that's coming out. I'm re-rinsing the green out of my brush, using my fingers to get the droplets off, but keeping the brush wet. I'm going to go to the top of the stem here and just lift out some highlights at the top as well. So now I'm using my small #2 round, and I'm going to go into the pollen area and add some additional details. So I'm going to use that really dark navy blue that was mixed up with my #2 round. And there are going to be some areas where we have shadows. So I'm just coming in and trying to be very selective with where I put them. I'm going to define a little bit more of what's going on at the top. So I'm coming in with that darker purple and blue mixture. I'm going to use that really dark navy blue to push some of the darks that are just very close to the center. And then as a last touch, I'm going to use some white watercolor gouache from Winsor Newton just to add a little bit of highlights. So clean water, small amount of white gouache on my palette. I'm not diluting it much because I want this to be opaque. So I'm only adding enough water so that I have a smooth consistency, but I do want it to be on the thicker side. And anywhere where I want just a little bit more definition or highlight, I'm going to come in, especially along some of the folds. I'm doing just very little. I don't want my brush too loaded up with paint, otherwise I won't be able to get narrow paint strokes. It'll always look wide. But otherwise, I feel like this little floral is done. So you can kind of do as minimal or as much white gouache as you feel necessary. It's easy to overdo it. So just take a moment to pause once in a while and ask yourself, is it really necessary in a couple areas before you just keep going? But I feel like I'm happy with that. We've got good contrast. We've got some dimension. It's pretty. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Give me a thumbs up, a follow, share with friends, and just keep painting and have a great time.